Hi, I'd like to welcome everybody to our Global Childhood Seminar tonight. It's the last one for 2022. And I'd like to particularly welcome everyone in the room here and also everybody who's online tonight. And I know that people online have registered from within Australia, but also from many countries overseas. So that's really exciting for us. I'd like to begin tonight by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather here tonight, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of university land. I respect and recognise the elders, past, present, and emerging, and I also respect their continued connection to the land and waters of this beautiful place that we live and work in. I acknowledge also that they've never ceded sovereignty. This evening, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Professor Mariana Souto-Manning, who is president and holds the Irving and Neeson Harris President's Chair of the renowned Erickson Institute in Chicago, Illinois, to our final Global Childhood Seminar. Our director of the Global Childhoods Research Hub, Nicola, has known Mariana for over 15 years. Mariana's first priority has always been to make a difference to the lives of young children and their families in hopeful and significant ways. Many of us have used her work over many years to inspire and deepen our own engagements with children's lives. I'm going to read a summary of her achievements. From a critical perspective, Mariana's research examines inequities and injustices in early childhood teaching and teacher education, recentering methodologies and pedagogies on the lives, values, and experiences of intersectionally minoritized people of color. As she problematizes issues of colonization, assimilation, and oppression in schooling and society, she critically examines theoretical and methodological issues and dilemmas of doing research with communities of color. She considers questions such as critical for whom and according to whom, as she investigates issues pertaining to equitable teaching and learning, focusing on languaging and literacy practices in pluralistic settings. Mariana regularly collaborates with teachers and engages in community-based research. And we've spent some time with Mariana this afternoon in conversation talking about some of these amazing ways that she and we can do some more work in this area. Thank you. Mariana, you're a prolific writer of publications that matter. In 2016, the book Reading, Writing and Talk, Inclusive Teaching Strategies for Diverse Learners, K-2, with Jessica Martell, a New York City public school teacher, was awarded the winner of the American Educational Studies Association Critics Award, and many more, which we've used over the years. Tonight, Mariana's talk is titled Toward Justice and Belonging in Early Childhood Teacher Education, a Moral and Ethical Imperative. It explores the commitment to pursue justice and foster belonging in early childhood teaching and teacher education as a moral and ethical imperative for our profession. I'd ask you to please keep your questions until after the talk. And also, if you're online, you can enter your questions into the Q&A button, and Nick is going to read them out at the end. So we'll address all of those together. I'm now going to hand over to Mariana.
Thank you so much, Sonia. It's wonderful being here. Thank you, everyone, for being here in person. Thank you to all of those who are joining via Zoom. It is such a pleasure to be here with you today. I want to thank Nicola and Sonia for the invitation to really imagine early childhood teaching and teacher education in more just ways, in ways that foster, cultivate, and sustain belonging. Within the context of the United States, lots of attention have been given to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Yet, very little exploration has been done related to the real meaning of these words within the context of early childhood teaching and teacher education, a profession that the first principle of the Code of Ethics is to first do no harm, and that includes social, psychological, emotional harm. So today in this symposium, I'm going to invite us to move away from diversity, equity, and inclusion and to commit to full belonging and true justice. You might be asking, what's the difference? Let me tell you a story. Zoom always and technology always have ways of humbling us. So, and we have to experience and grow with it. But for a long time, access has been a prioritized goal in early education, making sure that young children have the care and the education so that parents can go to work, so that they can be ready for school, and so much more. We have focused on access to kindergarten, access to preschool, access to pre-K, but access is not sufficient if our goal is to move toward true justice and full belonging. See, earlier this year, there was a study that was published, co-authored by Dale Farron, that found that low quality, culturally incongruent pre-K can actually be detrimental, having significant negative effects to young kids. Although this study was located within the context of Tennessee, it provided us with enough insight and confidence to say that access is simply insufficient. In fact, access may actually uphold harm in programs where children are not valued, told they're not enough, or that they don't speak correctly. As a result of having their identities, their practices diminished, silenced, negated, early childhood can ultimately inflict harm and perpetuate trauma. These findings show that sometimes we enact harm in the pursuit of justice, modeling this harmful conceptualization of justice for pre-service and in-service teachers. The notion of justice is aligned with English common law really often, and the protection of property and privileges, and also with notions of criminal justice. Within the context of early childhood classrooms, we tend to see these in terms of whether children share, the issue of ownership, as well as behavioral examples such as green light, red light, that really seeks to identify who broke the rules and what they deserve. As you can see here, the National Museum of African American History and Culture has published these aspects and assumptions of whiteness and white culture in the United States. I know we're not in the United States, but we share a common colonizer. So I would say that there are likely some parallels there. Justice, when defined from the dominant white culture, is based on English common law, on the protection of property and entitlements, and intent, not impact, counts. Now, this is not the kind of justice that we want to move toward in early childhood education. We want justice that will do right by children. Another conceptualization of justice is criminal justice, that crime is a violation of the law and of the state. So the law and the state are centered. Violations create guilt. Justice requires the state to determine blame or guilt and impose pain and punishment. The central focus is to get offenders what they deserve, the consequences. Again, these I would call carcerality and not justice. I have been thinking about justice for quite a bit of time. And the reason why is because a lot of us have used the term justice. We think we mean the same thing, but do we? What's the history of justice? So I draw on an adaptation of restorative justice that says that violations create obligations, and that justice involves victims, offenders, and community members in an effort to put things right, and that the central focus is making sure that those harmed are experiencing healing, and that those who harmed are engaged in repairing. So the key concepts are really in terms of respect, accountability, healing, and empathy. Now, I want to draw your attention to a framework that I'm going to be using. It's a transformative justice in education framework. It was developed by Maisha Wynn in 2020. And I'm going to use this framework as an analytic framework for identifying harm in and by early childhood education. Because, you know, so many of us entered early childhood education with the idea of doing right, with the idea of making sure that children can succeed. What I'm going to ask through this framework, and I can only give a few examples, but I explore you to keep these questions in mind. What harm has been caused? What obligations do we have? And I mean we as a field, because we're all interconnected, so we're all responsible. How might we put things right in early childhood education? And how do we repair harm so that we don't preclude the future generation of children from reaching their full potential? Now, this framework has interrelated layers that together make futures matter. So you have history matters, race matters, justice matters, and language matters. I'm going to start with an example of histories matter and how histories have mattered within the context of education at large and early childhood education. One specific harm that has been the ranking of races by cranial capacity, a flawed notion emanating from a study where Samuel Morton engaged in manipulation, unethical manipulation. Not only did Samuel Morton in 1839 operated on the assumption that brain sizes were a measure of intelligence, but he decided to discard smaller skulls of white people and larger skulls of Black people, and concluded that white people had larger cranial capacity, therefore higher IQs than Black people. Now, back in the 1800s, Morton's skull measurements were used to justify the institution of chattel slavery within the United States. If Africans were not the same species as Caucasians, then enslaving them was much more easily explained and excused. We can draw a parallel here to the Aboriginal population within the context of Australia. Today, we understand that both the theory of polygeny, which is that human beings were not of different races, but of different species instead, and Morton's skull measurements were deeply flawed. However, they are associated with stereotyping and positions today, like the existence of racialized IQs and so much more. There's so many ways in which IQ, intelligence, and the racialization of so much get constructed as a result of a study that has been flawed from the very beginning. Now, there are so many other examples, but I wanted to mention this one because so much of testing has rested on the ability for us to remain objective, when in reality, the very first study showed that we cannot remain objective. I can't ascertain whether Samuel Morton believed that white people were more intelligent and therefore he had the moral obligation to remove the smaller skulls, and Black people were less and engaged in such action. So intentionality is not something that I can ascertain here, but regardless, this historical matter continues to impact how education, how society sees mainstream Australians or unmarked Australians versus Aboriginal community, individuals and communities. Now, relatedly, race matters. And race matters in early childhood. We have seen many examples of that, but perhaps one of the most poignant ones were developed by Clark and Clark in 1947. They gave children ages 3 to 7, a white doll and a Black doll, Black children. And really, Black children identified the Black dolls with not being as smart, not being as pretty, and not being as good, which signaled their internalization of racism and really limited their ability to see the future that they could and should have. Now, of course, that the Clarks concluded that prejudice, discrimination, and segregation created a feeling of inferiority among African-American children and damaged their self-esteem. So this was the finding of their psychological research. Although this was a long time ago, it persists today. Here's a more recent representation of its persistent effects on the lives of young children.
Which doll is the Black doll? And which one is the white doll?
The
Which doll is the pretty doll? Which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll? Which doll is the nice doll? And which doll is the bad doll? And why is that doll pretty?
Because he's white and he has 2 eyes.
Which doll is the ugly doll? Why is that doll ugly?
Because he's black.
Which doll looks most like you?
Like me.
Yeah, which one looks like you?
And that one,
Okay.
that doll.
Since this video was created, we have experienced,
Which doll?
there have been similar videos that have been produced within the context of Brazil, Mexico, Italy, within the context of Korea. And so we can see there how the anti-Blackness ideology really pervades so many countries. And a lot of times those come to the classroom as the construction of pathologies. So I want for you to see what that may translate into the classroom, especially when we have certain expectations.
みんなの心に浮かんだことをそのまま書けばいいんだからね。
So everyone's concerned.
何書いたのね、教えてくれるかな。
Child is examined by doctors, removed from the
マリーナの
classroom.
空に向かってピンピンと突き立った声を
Institutionalized, coloring every single piece of paper black. It turns out that his imagination was much greater than our ability to conceptualize what he was doing. So I share these because I think that it's important for us to realize that when children really internalize some of their racism, sense of inferiority, a lot of times we are complicit within those situations. Now you may be saying, okay, but what about Black people? So I want for you now to imagine early childhood teachers who are entering the profession or who are in the profession and the experiences that they had as children being racialized. And what can we do about that?
There's something about having dark skin on a woman's body that shapes the way she moves through the world. There's something about having darker skin on a male body that shapes the way in which he moves through the world. It has real life stakes.
From what I've seen growing up, dark skin equates to being poor, dirty, ratchet.
They tend to be the bad guys in Tyler Perry movies.
Straight from the border.
That doesn't even make any sense. I'm not deemed as beautiful, therefore I am not beautiful. And those two are not really mutually exclusive.
Could it be that something as early as colonization or slavery is primarily responsible for our beauty standards today? We're talking about who works in the field and who works in the house. We're also talking about rape, the rape of slaves to produce people who are known as mulattoes or mixed race. These standards of beauty travel. Eurocentric standards of beauty travel.
In the Dominican society and our culture, they have a phrase that's like mejorando la raza, advancing the Dominican population and making sure we're going into how they say the better. If you're lighter, you're bettering the race and you're bettering the island versus if you're just being you.
I would get called the blackness. One joke that really stuck with me was like, oh, Edgar's so black that when he leaves a car, the check engine light turns on. That was a reference to my skin being as dark as oil. I felt ugly being of a darker skin tone. So I tried to gel my hair, or I started listening to skater punk music. So I tried culturally to lighten myself, if that makes sense.
I went on a trip to Korea with my mom. Some woman walked up to my mom and she asked, "Why is your daughter so dark?" In Korea, you have to be pale, and I almost felt like a foreigner and not so much Korean anymore.
When we turn off the lights, they say, "Oh, Salorm, where did you go?" Or, "Oh, you're really pretty for a dark-skinned girl." Are you saying that my race and just the fact that I am black, is that not attractive in general?
I remembered one time that I wanted to be an angel in a parade. At that time, they were like kind of racist, you know, they didn't like black people to be angels. And my mommy got kind of freaked out. She was going like, please don't, you cannot be an angel because they're gonna laugh at you. I said, but mommy, I am an angel. And finally, I was an angel. And I was the only black angel walking in the street. And my mommy was so proud about it, and I was proud too.
My mom started buying me a cream called Fair and Lovely. I was in 3rd grade when I started using bleaching creams. And the whole general idea was, if I'm lighter, I'll have a better life. I'll find somebody that's gonna love me. There would still be light and dark patches on my body and my face. It's painful, it would hurt, and I started breaking out in like bad rashes. And no one said anything. I had to stop it myself.
How do we fix this?
It's something that I don't usually talk about.
So I wanted to show you that because a lot of times children don't come to our classrooms unharmed. Societal standards and ideas have already done so. And as these adults reflect on their lives, reflect on the need to lighten the skin when the mother is trying to protect her daughter from discrimination. Those are things that we need to take into consideration in terms of race mattering, not only for how young children see themselves, but also for how adults grow. When you think about, I know that they talked about slaves and in the video, but I also want for you to think about the parallel to the silent generation in terms of how is it that Aboriginal children were replaced in white families as a way of making sure that perhaps they had a better future. And nowadays we recognize the damage that has been caused, or at least part of it. So just a few examples of how race matters. Now we're going to justice matters, and we've talked about justice already. So I'm just going to say that it is not carcerality, it is not about the protection of privileges, but it's really asking who has been hurt, what are their needs, and whose obligations are these? And it's always our obligation, societal obligation, because we're all interconnected. We're all responsible as a profession for righting wrongs. And that means that we have to heal harms, but also address the causes so that we're not just putting a Band-Aid over, but we're really working toward justice. Now, finally, language matters. And there's so many ways that language matters. But Baker Bell has talked about how anti-Black linguistic racism is pervasive, and I would document in early childhood classrooms. Examples of everyday practice enacting harm onto racialized and intersectionally minoritized children are standards of early learning, including academic language. Why is academic language the way that the dominant group in society speaks? That way, we give an advantage to kids who are in families that mirror that dominant way of talking and making sense of the world, and we construct deficits from the very beginning. Subject-verb agreements. Within the context of the US, Black populations for hundreds of years have said they is. It wasn't until the Associated Press decided that they is, because of gender, was acceptable that it became acceptable. We also see the difference between Southern English and Black English. Southern English is spoken by white people. Black English spoken by Black people. One is a regionalism, the other one is seen as an error or broken language. Interactional norms. Now, if I see you and I greet you, I may say, hi, how are you? Now, if you know that this is not a question, but a greeting, you will keep walking and you will say, hi, how are you? Or hi. But if you're not familiar with this disguising of a greeting in the form of a question, you may say, oh, you won't believe it. I am so jet lagged. I may not make sense of these. And you know, by the way, I'm not, you're like, that's too much information, but you asked. So those invisible rules in society really serve as borders to exclude young children, to exclude international students, to exclude those who are not part of dominant culture. Conventions of politeness. Would you like to? Right? We're not really asking if you would like to. That's a polite way, but it's a question. So I always resort back to my youngest child's story, which is he was in a toddler classroom and at Teachers College, Columbia. And I went to pick him up and his teacher said, oh, I wanted to let you know that today I asked Thomas to clean up and he said no. And so I'm talking to Thomas and I said, Thomas, what happened at cleanup time? And he said, well, Emmy asked if I wanted to clean up and I said no. I said, well, you know, that was not polite. And next day he goes back and she asked him the same question. Would you like to clean up? And that time he looked very proud, stood up and said, no, thank you. That was not the preferred response. But you can see how all of a sudden kids whose home practices do not mirror the expectations of politeness in the classroom may be constructed as problems. For me, being a professor in the institution, being linked to the preschool, really gave him lots of different framings there. But those are things, those are borders and obstacles that we navigate day in and day out. And then the devaluing of orality and overprivileging of written texts. And that, in a way, is very much an anti-Indigenous practice because so much wrongdoing has been done to Indigenous communities via written text, via treaties that have been disrespected, translated in different ways, deeds for lands, and so on. So in addition to that, we have the labeling. And labeling, when the labels are deficit-ridden, they denigrate the abilities and experiences of children. Sometimes you hear teachers saying, I may speak negatively about my students to other teachers, but when I enter my classroom, I treat each one of them equally. That's not possible because language is really a powerful and event-changing behavior in and of itself. Language is performative. So you may not say that, but you will, in a way, have some sort of veil that's going to inform your view of that child. So if we accept the view that language as a behavior make things happen and continue to happen, acts such as describing children as being at risk, for instance, have lifelong impacts on the children in early care and education. So I wanted to just offer you a few examples of this framework, but now we are going to spend the rest of the time really focusing on the future. Futures matter, and a lot of times they can be scary. And part of that is that we don't quite know them. We know that what we have is not just, but we need to ascribe to a North Star logic that has guided fugitive Black feminists across disciplines, upending the whiteness historically sedimented in early childhood education. Now, within the context of the US, you can think about stars guiding enslaved peoples toward freedom. Here, you can think about Aboriginal people really navigating what is called Australia today, guided by stars and not knowing what's out there. This necessarily means appending restrictive and exclusionary notions of early childhood teacher education, along with its current priorities. We really need to think and rethink early childhood education in plural and expansive ways. Now, you may be thinking, okay, how? Through the rethinking of belonging. A lot of times we see all of these posters, you belong here. Just saying or posting you belong here doesn't make so. Despite the importance of belonging to early education, not all children have their needs to belong met. This also applies to early childhood teachers, pre-service and in-service. Can they pronounce words correctly? Do they have an accent? Do they look professional? All of those are questions that we need to consider. Belonging is deeply entwined with hierarchies of power in society. If you fit in as American, or if you don't, if you fit in as Australian or you don't. As pervasively conceptualized, belonging is deeply rooted in a politics of racialized exclusion. And while early childhood teaching and teacher education has embraced this rhetoric of belonging quite strongly, it continues to protect the interests of whiteness, centering dominant white monolingual English-speaking child who represents characteristics typically associated with power and with dominant stories. Now, I want for you to just take a minute and think. In our classrooms and preschools, whose belonging is ensured? Whose belonging is questioned? How do you know? Just turn to the person next to you for 1 minute and talk about that. And if you're online, consider that question. Feel free to add to the chat. Okay, so these are questions that I would love for you to keep in mind, regardless of whether you work in a preschool, preparing teachers with communities, looking at syllabi. As I look at my syllabi workshop, whose belonging is ensured? Whose belonging is questioned? And how do I know? What evidence do I have for it? Because a lot of times we think about, oh, I have that book in my classroom, but that may be 1 out of 80 books. But we note that because it's different. The other ones are labeled or seen as normal. But I did ask you to discuss, so whose belonging is ensured? Can someone share? And I'll repeat for the folks on Zoom. Every year it changes. So yes, belonging is very much context dependent. Sometimes depending on who the teacher is. Sometimes depending on who the teacher is, sometimes depending on the year, the background of the children. All of those are factors that definitely impact who belongs. Thank you. Someone else?
The children who comply, who do what we want them to do, sit down when we want them to do, don't challenge us. The children who find it difficult, I think, are whose belonging is not ensured, are the children who bring those challenging behaviours and we don't know what to do with them.
Thank you. So I want for you to continue thinking about these as we move forward. What I want to share with you is that belonging is complex. It's not simply a competency to be achieved by the student, by the learner, whether it's a child, pre-service teacher, and service teacher, but it needs to be reconceptualized in the pursuit of justice as the right of every learner and a key responsibility of early childhood teachers and teacher educators. The harms enacted by exclusion, by feeling that you don't belong here, by questioning your place, your intelligence, your aptitude, need to be suspended. Now, belonging a lot of times is seen as static and as neutral. Here, I invite you to think of belonging as political. And the current politics of belonging works to maintain borders and boundaries, and to exclude racialized students and learners. A lot of times, those are the students that do not fit in because they have not been socialized into raising their hands to speak. In my household, there's an art of just getting in when there's a little silence. And that's quite complex compared to raising your hand. But that does mean that a lot of times I will cut in talks and people are like, you just cut me off. So instead of judging others against our own practices, it's important for us to understand, to learn more. Racialized teachers are routinely denied belonging, whether it is because they don't look professional, they don't dress professionally, they have an accent. And we see that within the context of Australia, but when you have international schools, for example, in China, the upfront teachers are often native speakers who are white, from England or the US. And so that racialization and that denial of belonging and professionalization is not specific to one country. It's very much a global process. And these processes of assimilation, erasure, and subjugation are central to the politics of belonging. Really, they inflict emotional, social, and psychological harm. So before I get to the racialized teachers, I want to just say that a lot of times we think of belonging as a given. It isn't. We may have experienced belonging as a given, but a lot of times, some people are ascribed belonging right away, some are denied. Who is ascribed belonging as a teacher, as a professor, as a business person, as a janitorial staff member? Why is it that we have these ideas? It's not that we individually have these ideas, but that we have been socialized in a society that offers those racialized models to us. And it's important for us to disrupt that for young children. Then young children are often, to belong, they either assimilate, means they perform in a certain way. They assimilate being Kiwi or being Australian or being American and speaking a certain way, using questions as measures of politeness, or they engage in processes of erasure. One of them causes harm, the other trauma. Erasing yourself, cutting yourself from your family, from your community, thinking of yourself and your practices as lesser than. So racialized teachers are often told that to belong, they must reject the communicative practices, values, and experiences of their families and communities. Their identities are constantly under siege. And they feel pressure to undergo processes of erasure and assimilation, eventually experiencing an assimilative shift over time in their self-identities and their sense of belonging. Now, white teachers really also need to disrupt the too often over-exaggerated sense of themselves and of their place in the world, and their knowledges, perspectives, and practices. We need to really trouble and upend the place, their place in the world as norm, as baseline, as exemplar, against which others are measured. It's not about devaluing, it's about expanding. Expanding whose practices, whose ways of being and communicate belong. And they need to unlearn in order to learn about the brilliance of racialized individuals, families, and communities. Many of them have been miseducated. They may have been schooled, but they have been miseducated about the history of Aboriginal peoples in Australia, or the history of indigenous communities within the context of the US. What are the areas that we can help teachers unlearn and recognize that it's not an individual choice, but it's an outcome of a system that has very much been designed to forward one narrative over another? And then commit and move toward a more just future. Yet, the field's long-standing politics of belonging does not fully consider how deeply emotional belonging is. Most teachers of color leave the classroom within the first 3 years. Not belonging impairs the self-esteem and self-actualization of children and youth. And if their teachers are feeling like they don't belong and their self-esteem and self-actualization are impacted, the teaching is impacted. And the denial of belonging excludes, marginalizes, and inflicts emotional harm. So I am sharing with you and proposing that we move from this idea of diversity and inclusion to justice and belonging. A lot of the work that we have engaged in so far really focuses on the intrapersonal level, the self and self-discovery, the challenging, the questioning of biases. To move to justice and belonging, we need to attend to the interpersonal level and to the organizational level. That means making sure that our relationship with others, that microaggressions don't go untroubled, and that microaffirmations are promoted and very much part of everyday interactions. That really changes the interpersonal and organizational level. That's only then that we get to the societal level. Now, you may be wondering, what are racial microaggressions? You heard some of them. One that I get a lot of times is, where are you from? And you know, I lived in New York for a long time, so I would say New York. Where are you really from? Manhattan? Where are your people from? That is a way of saying you don't really belong here, right? Or, why do you sound so white? You speak English so well. What are some of the microaggressions? So we need to name those as microaggressions, but also make sure that we don't engage, that we don't condone them. So when we say your name is too hard to pronounce, can I call you Mary? If you can't even learn the name of the child, the name of the teacher, how are we dehumanizing that individual? So Chester Pierce was a psychiatrist at Harvard. And in 1978, he defined microaggressions as subtle, stunning, often automatic and nonverbal exchanges, which are in effect put downs. Then racial microaggressions were defined by Solórzano and Uber as one form of systemic everyday racism used to keep those at the social margins in their place. Common microaggressions are feeling out of place because of race, teachers having lower expectations for racialized children, and subtle and not so subtle experiences with racial discrimination. Now, racial microaffirmations, on the other hand, and this book was just published in 2020, are everyday forms of affirmation and validation that people of color engage in a variety of public and private settings. The nods, smiles, embraces, use of language, and other actions that express acknowledgement, respect, and self-worth. The way that sometimes when you walk by a Black person being Black, there's an acknowledgement of your humanity. Racial microaffirmations are the subtle, verbal or nonverbal strategies that racialized people of color engage that affirm each other's dignity, integrity, and shared humanity. And these moments of shared cultural intimacy allow people of color to feel acknowledged, respected, and valued in a society that constantly and perpetually seeks to dehumanize us. Now, as we think about moving from microaggressions to microaffirmations, and that's really important because when we are only examining what's inside of us, we may feel guilty. We may individualize something that's systemic. We may stop on our tracks. Now, if we think about identifying and interrupting microaggressions, we're doing something interactionally. And if we're thinking about microaffirmations, organizationally, we're doing something different. So I want to draw on some teachers of color lessons for us in early childhood teacher education. So moving from microaggressions to microaffirmations, what should early childhood teacher education learn from early childhood teachers of color to develop an antidote to its overwhelming whiteness that continues to disadvantage racialized individuals and communities? Now, this is the piece from what the lessons are drawn. Here are my co-authors. They're all teachers in New York City. And one of the things that they have said again and again is that teacher educators always come and do workshops. They tell us what we should do, what we could do, what we don't do, but they never really ask us what they should be doing. So there are 5 consejos, and these consejos are really counter narratives to the current teacher education. So the first one is foster the abolition of racialized belonging, like abolishing practices that silence, isolate, marginalize, and invalidate racialized persons and community in teacher education, and really fostering a future where racialized teachers are affirmed and feel belonging. Now, that may sound simple, but it's far from it. Where are people in your syllabus? What about assignments? What about placements? The second thing that they said is ensure that teacher education honors and sustains the full humanity of racialized and minoritized individuals and communities by working to intentionally and systematically problematize and upend its whiteness. And whiteness here is the unfettered right to exclude, the settled expectations of relative white privilege as a legitimate and natural baseline. So it is not a phenotype, it is not an individual identity. And that's drawn on the work of Harris. To debunk racist myths that inform teacher education practices. For example, the neutrality and validity of standardized tests, especially for young children. Individual agency being sufficient for a person to overcome systemic barriers. If you just work hard enough, that doesn't quite happen that way. So in doing that by design, and really require racialized and minoritized histories, ways, and systems of knowing, as well as community values, voices, and cultural practices to be centered in teacher education. Ask yourself, are Aboriginal systems and ways of knowing central in the preparation and development of teachers? To cultivate opportunities and spaces in teacher education where racialized and minoritized teacher candidates and teachers experience joy, happiness, healing, care, justice, and affirmation. These teachers told again and again that they were expected to suffer. they were expected to be illustrating much of what their peers were learning about being objectified. Of course, that these includes, but it's not limited to more diverse teacher educators, racial and ethnic affinity spaces for healing, learning, and building. A lot of times we really don't necessarily think about the power of exploring within an affinity group who we are, what we can do, what's our responsibility, without burdening other communities and allowing different communities to engage in this work and move forward. And then finally, they said many of them had gone to teacher education programs, had accrued debt. And so they said that as part of reparations for past injustices, it's important to work to secure that teacher education is free, of high quality, and educative, culturally relevant, justice-oriented, to those who are racialized and intersectionally minoritized. So as a teacher educator, now I'm an administrator, but as a teacher educator, I took heed on their call. And at Erickson, we are launching in May a new program that's a triple certification program in early childhood education, special education, and bilingual ESL endorsement. But we are having full tuition and fee awards available to those teachers who have really grown up in divested communities and promised to teach for 4 years in a divested community. And we know that that matters because we know that shared student-teacher demographics positively impact student success. It's not a small impact, it's quite a big one. There are also teacher shortages, which I know have affected Australia, New Zealand. So, and the turnover, especially of teachers of color, is quite well documented. So how do we deal with the underrepresentation of teachers when we create obstacles for teachers to be certified? Again, here you have a few statistics that Black students who had one Black teacher before 3rd grade are 13% more likely to go to college. This figure jumps to 32% if they have 2 Black teachers in their early childhood years. So it's really, really important. It's not that we should only have teachers of color, but we should have white teachers and teachers of color because they make an impact in the very futures of children of color. And we have done this so far through philanthropic support, but really thinking about how is it that we are contributing to a more equitable society? How is it that programs like this can be incorporated into policy? Because we are always thinking about how teachers of color, how indigenous teachers, how racialized teachers don't want to go into teaching without recognizing the debt that they accrue many times by going through programs and getting certified, even if they have the qualifications and they immigrate to a new country and have to go all over again. Like me, I taught in Brazil, then I moved to the United States, started from English 101 because in a community college because the US did not recognize my experience or preparation in Brazil. And I know that that's a common phenomenon here as well. So our approach is really to have this 12-month program. Joining the program will be cohorts of 30. And then we're studying this model, but really thinking about forming professional learning communities that are around affinities and placing more teachers in the same school as a way of creating community. So I look forward to hopefully getting to share some of that with you. We just had an event, a luncheon, and our speaker was Michelle Obama. And she had a quote that I think would be is relevant for us. Justice for children means every child gets access to the resources, the philosophy, and the training that's available through the Erickson Institute. All children have the potential to be amazing, but we have to invest. We have to invest in every child as we would our own. This is my wish. This is my hope. So we are really thinking about not only recruitment, but retention and culturally relevant preparation, supportive working conditions, working with administrators and with district leaders so that we are able to provide the environment where teachers can continue to grow. And then at the legislative level, working toward competitive and equitable compensation, because we know, at least within the context of the US, that childcare professionals are underpaid as it relates to, for example, high school teachers. So I will stop here and just say that my hope, and I present the Erickson case as one case, as really taking heed on the lesson that these teachers gave us. Rarely do we ask teachers to tell us what they wish they would have had, what they wish for the future of teacher preparation and development, especially those who are racialized and have remained in the profession, such as these long-term. What made them stay? What were some of the obstacles? So my hope is that as a predominantly white profession, we'll listen and learn from racialized children, teachers, families, and communities. A lot of times we think we equate schooling with education. And that's a big mistake because we undervalue the education that so many community members can really contribute. But my greatest hope is that early childhood teacher education programs can recommit to upending microaggressions, fostering microaffirmations, and suspending harm, while committing to cultivate full belonging and true justice. So thank you. And I would love to engage with questions, if you comments. I don't know. I hope that I've given you enough to think about. Yes.
I'll bring you.
Hold
the
on a
mic so
second,
that
because
people
Sonia is
online
making
can-
her way to you.
So I really enjoyed that talk, and it's very thought-provoking, and there's a lot that is relevant to the Australian context. My question's a little bit provocative, but I'm just interested in your views. So I haven't had time to kind of put it in the right way. So I hope you take it in the right spirit. So I study groups, right? A school could be seen to be a group, and groups function very well when they have shared norms, values, and beliefs that coordinate purpose, activity, outcomes, visions, in terms of what everyone in that group is trying to do. So what you've sort of challenged here, quite rightly, is this idea that the norms, values, and beliefs that define a school are ones that are ethnically defined and defined by the dominant power group in society, and that's what you're challenging. But equally, we know something will have to come in its place, right? So because groups will function best when there is that sense of shared mission. Now, those defining features might be ones that are inclusive, they're bottom up, they've been done in a culturally sensitive way. They might be always renewed, but I'm just wondering if you could comment a little bit on that. And if you are a group that's trying to function well,
yes,
someone or the community at some point is going to have to define a way in which we sort of do things around here.
Absolutely. I think that those are really valid points. I think that what we need to is move from more restrictive notions of belonging and rules and norms and agreements to more expansive ones. A lot of times, instead of learning and expanding our repertoire of practices, of ways of being interacting, and even noting that as being a different way of doing something, we tend to discourage that. We tend to ascribe to what's comfortable to us. Teachers oftentimes have in their classrooms books that were favorites in their own childhood, without realizing that that is an unspoken norm. The indirect rules of interaction in terms of politeness, that's another unspoken norm. So it's really important for us to make visible some of those borders that really serve to order, order, and really they're hyper visible to some of us if we have not been familiar or raised within that practice, but they are hyper visible to those of us who are pressed against them. So it's important for us to think about how do we expand and how do we think about there's this way of doing that, there's this way of doing that. So instead of evaluating, giving different value to different practices, to really think about, this is a way to do this is another way to do it. One of the ways that I used to do this with my year 2 students was to tally mark, and actually year 1 and K as well. Within the context of the US, you have the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 kind. Within the context of Brazil, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you can actually see something like this. And it doesn't depend on children's fine motor skills. Because if their fine motor skills are not developed, they can still see the tally mark in Brazil. So instead of restricting the tools, it's about expanding the tools. Instead of restricting the norms, it's about expanding the norms so that people feel more belonging. It doesn't take any belonging away from folks who already have, but it's really about expanding and making that more plural so that we are not just ascribing belonging to those who operate in a certain way. Because when we do that, then we make mistakes, right? The archetype of folks like me who have an accent is that you get to hear sometimes things that you're like, okay, I see where you're going. So the other day I called to change my plane ticket and they were telling me something that didn't make sense. So I said, oh, I can't understand that. And the woman went, oh, you can't understand that? I'm like, no, I can understand what you're saying. I don't understand why this is not possible, right? But if I didn't have an accent, the response would have been completely different. And so it's important for us to think about how is it that we make sure that kids don't feel ashamed of their accent, but that other kids see their accent as evidence of multilingualism. How is it that we can really disrupt some of the labels that are deficit-ridden and make sure that we see that as an asset? And instead of pathologizing the child or the teacher, that we look at the system. How can this be reorganized? How can teacher education really ensure that teachers are living with an understanding of Aboriginal systems and ways of knowing? And that's the beginning.
Nick, are there any online comments?
Thank you to the folks online who stuck with us.
I have no voice, so this is very hard because I really like what you said about, to Kate's question about, expanding is not taking away. And mine's more of a comment because as a result of imperative here in Victoria, we've got, like many places, we've got a shortage, and we developed a 1-year graduate diploma online for early childhood teaching, and it's totally based in Indigenous worldviews as the foundation. It's about starting that process of shifting and reconceptualizing belonging. I won't talk anymore.
No, absolutely. I think that that's the beginning, especially because when we individualize that issue, then we're pathologizing teachers. We're saying, you don't know, you didn't consider, instead of saying, wow, we all did not learn these. We have the responsibility to make sure that our students are socialized or educated in this very important part of what we call Australia.
I also like the way you talked about, school and education, because education is lifelong and life-wide. It happens in schools, communities, and homes. And the idea of, we've been doing some work around what constitutes educational success. And it's really about doing school. It's about, in terms of some of the work done by Watkins and Noble too, about, creating a scholarly habitus. And again, that group behavior becomes about doing what the group wants, and rather than changing what the group wants and making it broader. So I think that's really important.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I think we'll finish off with Kelly's question here.
This isn't really a question. It's just linking in with Nicola talking about the graduate diploma. So I'm supporting students in that at the moment, and I'm marking their assessments. And some of the assessments are just so fabulous because it's actually about how the students are interrogating policy. So they're actually going to the system. They're going to all those beautifully bound policy documents that are in the kindergartens, and they're actually asking questions about why things are done. So that's such an important place to be. And I think within the busyness of early childhood, teachers, a lot of teachers who have actually been interrogated through these assessments from the students, they're actually a little bit stuck for, oh my gosh, well, why don't we do that, even though it's actually in our policy? So that is really, really critical.
It is, and I think that can lead to an organic shift in policies. I think in a lot of ways, elected officials are more open than we imagine to consider different alternatives if we have evidence and if there's enough resonance. So we have been able to work with elected officials in Illinois to pass, for example, the Too Young to Test bill statewide that prevents state funding from being allocated for standardized tests for children 8 and under because of the lack of reliability. It doesn't mean that they are not assessed. It definitely means that there needs to be ways that are robust of assessment, but we're shifting the focus from the child as a unit to the classroom and the preschool as the unit of analysis.
I'm going to ask a really quick question.
Okay.
In Australia, we have a conversation going on about allyship and being an ally, being an effective ally, particularly for our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues. And I wonder whether you could comment on the notion of allyship and the movement of white privileged people like me to move in a particular way to be a more effective ally.
I'm going to draw on the work of a good friend, Bettina Love. And Bettina has a video that was done at the Schomburg Museum for African American History in New York, where she talks about allyship as more passive, as watching, as lamenting that things are not happening, as talking with. And she says that we need to move from allyship to being a co-conspirator. She gave the example of the woman who climbed the flagpole in the South Carolina state capitol as a protest. And a white man, when they were going to electrocute the pole, put his hand on it. And the fact that he put his hand on it, and the police knew that he would die as well, stopped them from doing what they were going to do. So really thinking about how can I be more active in interrupting injustice and using my privilege to do so, not only in terms of microaggressions, but macro as well. So that I'm not just saying, oh, that's too bad, that shouldn't have happened, but that I'm actually changing the outcome. But I would encourage all of you to look. It's actually on C-SPAN, but it's this video by Bettina Love. And I can also send the link to Sonia, and hopefully you can just share with those in attendance. That way you get a little bit more of an idea. But I think that, we have to sometimes put our privilege on the line in order to make change happen.
I'm going to step in now. And first of all, I just wanted to check if you're happy for us also to share your PowerPoints.
That's fine.
And I want to say a huge thank you once again. I think we've unsettled a lot of our thinking and humbled a lot of the ways that we've previously maybe thought that we are allies. I think that was a really good question. And I'll think of that electrocution for a little bit. Thank you so much. I just want to give you a small token of our appreciation and something you can put your badge into.
Thank you. All right. Thank you so very much. Thank you for being here. I do think that in a lot of ways, when we think about our profession, we want to do good. No one enters our profession with the intent of really promoting harm or cultivating trauma, but sometimes we just don't know. But, to end with Toni Morrison's words, now that we know better, we need to do better. So I hope that you can take that on.